Okay. Mitzvah Kuf Chav Dalet. Mitzvah Ho'arba v'esrim u'mei hi shetzivonu lo niach ma she'ispared v'yipo mino anovim. In Kapach, it says shenosha v'nofal. Noshal, it was somehow, Nosha is also somewhat removed and to fall. V'yipo mino anovim v'bitziloson. At the time of the harvest of Betzira is called, of Anovim, of grapes is called Betzira, Lani. So here, the mitzvah, he says, it's Laniach Peret, it's called Peret. Laniach Peret HaKerem, that's his mean HaKotzer. In the Protei mitzvahs, La'azev Peret HaKerem. Okay, it's Peret. So it's very clear that the matona is Mishas Betzira, and that the Ram in Hilchos Matan Zaniyim, Perek Dalid Halacha Tesvav, Ezehu Peret Ze Galga Echod or Shnei Galgarim Hanifrotim Min Eshkol. So there's an Eshkol and there's a Nifrat, and the Nifrat, that which somehow becomes detached from the eshkol, is called peret. That is b'shas betzira. But however, the shloisha gargarim, 3 grapes, b'bas achas ain't no peret. What's called b'bas achas? We have no clue whether that's in one ma'aseh betzira. I don't know exactly why terchidei dibur should be meaningful over here. But I assume it's in each ma'aseh b'tzira, but I have no clue. Okay? The most important question which we have to deal with over here is the following. There is a mitzvah which we learned already called leket. And there is a mitzvah called peret. The leket means if 1 or 2 fall b'shas ktsira, it's called leket. If it's 3, it's not leket. And peret, if it's 1 or 2 fall b'shat betzira, it's called peret. If it's 3, it's not peret. So the question is, why should it be 2 mitzvahs in the minyan? It should be inyan echad of those 1 or 2 things which fall b'shas the betzira, whatever, and it should be 1 mitzvah, minyan mitzvahs. And that's what we said. That's the whole Shurish test is based on the fact that if it's inyan echad, it's 1 mitzvah, even though it's repeated in many different ways, in different signal, a different style. But if it really means 1, then it's 1. So, for example, we found in Shurish test that he talks about 3 different types of shikha. The shikha in the Tvua, the shikha in Zaysim, and the shikha in Anovim. Then the Ram says that it's all 1 mitzvah. The Torah just said it over in Kefel in a different signal. So why would they say the same thing over here? So a priori, the answer is because Chazal are very careful to give it a different name. And the Monchurim, Kuf Lamed Aleph, Arba Matonish Bekerem HaPeret Va'olos V'Shikha Peret. It's something. It's not called leket. It's called peret. Shloisha B'Tfua HaLeket HaShikha Va'Peret. And each one of these is separate mitzvahs. But we have no clue what we're talking about. We know the Chazal call it a different name. We have no clue at all why it's a different inyan from Inyanei HaTorah. So I would say the part of the clue to understand this is that saying what we said before was very simplistic and basically a different dinim of peret and leket. The Gemara Tmura on Daf Chaf Hey Amar Aleph says that this has a discussion about Nishiras Ruboy in Leket, that that there should be Schias Aniyim. It's a question. You're mafkir at that point. Are you the Bailim? Not the Bailim, but Nishiras Kuloi. Nishiras Kuloi L'Chaira is certainly Leket. However, in Peret, you get the impression from reading a Mishnah in Peah that the Peret, the Zchiyah, should be B'shas Nefila ala Oretz. We'll see exactly if that's accurate 100% or not. The Mishnah says in Peah Zayin Mishnah Gimel, Hamaniach es HaKalkola Tachas HaGefen, he puts a basket underneath the Gefen when he's doing B'tzira, B'shoshu Boitzer, Harize Geisel es Aniyim. V'al ze nema al tasik gvul oilim. But it says, Harize Geisel Aniyim, is that really Gezel, or it's a pseudo Gezel? And the Goyin seems to interpret that it's not real Gezel. It's a pseudo Gezel or a gram Gezel. The Shnois Elio in Peah there, in Perek Zayin, Mishnah Gimel, shows there Lakotzer, Hameniach es HaKalkola, Kishiyipol Me'ilon, Lo yiforet. Very important word. Lo yiforet. Shakalkola rach. V'lo yishpo ma shenoifel olov. Harizeh, he says, it's harizeh is it's a gezel aniyim. It's a, what's the gezel? That he's geirem. It's not the fact. You see, what peret is, when the cluster falls, the peret, it's not nifrat b'shas the betzira itself. When it falls on the ground, it becomes disattached, and at that point, it's peret. Okay, so if he puts, it's not that it means nefila ala oretz, but it means that because of nefila, you see, what happens is in leket, the leket makes a neshira. The etzem lekit, the etzem ksira makes a lekita. In peret, it's not that the betzira does anything. It sets up a situation that the eshkol will fall, and by falling, sometimes various grapes will be detached. And if 2 are detached, it's peret, and if 3 is not peret. So the matana of leket is when the shiras rubai, or a little bit after the shiras rubai, depending on how you work out the Gemara, what the answer is. It's a suffix in the Gemara. B'shas the ksira, and the peret is the hitting on the ground and causing it to be dislodged. And the emesis, the Gemara in Tmura on Yud Zayin, is only by leket, not by peret, because it's not peret in that case. Peret is when it hits the ground. So the person who puts the karkola, which is rach, in order to cushion the fall that it shouldn't be dislodged, that's not peret anymore. And that's the Geisel Aniyim. He's geirem, they shouldn't get the matana. And the Rambam says Again, the peret, the shenifrat min anovim, and that even clearer over here. Kishipol me'oilon lo yiporet. Shekalkola, that's the going to say, shekalkola, it cushions it. So if the definition of peret, according to the Ram, is galgorim haniflotim min ha'eshkol, b'shas b'tzira, and the assumption is, if you put in a kalkola, the assumption is in the whole institution of kalkola, which is the gezel aniyim, is that it's when it hits the oritz. The question is, since it basically is dislodged, but maybe that should not be enough to make it a different matana, because it, by the nature of anovim, it's dislodged when it hits the oretz, and by the nature of tfuah, it could be dislodged b'shas ksira. So we have to say, is this something? You find another difference, possibly, and that I think is much clearer, that in leket, it's the maisek tzira which is machayev. In peret, b'tzira by itself is not machayev. You need a shiur b'tzira. And that the Ram says applies both to peret and to oilos. He says in Peret Daled, Aloch Chav Beis, he says, Eino aniyim zoichim likach peret v'oilos ad shiaschel balakerim livso kalmoy shnemo ki yivso kalmoy lois oilo. And you need, it's not a betziris ilon, it's a betziris kerem. V'kamo yivso v'yu zoichin bohem shloisha eskolos shehein oisin revia. But if you don't do a maisek tzira of shloisha eskolos, you have nothing. So I found these two differences, different dinim. The question is how different they are, what they are. For example, the Ram talks about, when he quotes Gemara Tmura, he only quotes it by leket. Hamafkir es haleket im nefilas ruboy hefker me'acha shenosha ruboy ein loy rishus boy. So roiv of the thing falls off, it's already nothing. The question is, do we have a similar thing by peret? And there's no discussion about it at all. And the peret is shenifrat min o eshkol. That's what he says. Gargorim anifratim min o eshkol. B'shas b'tzira. That's the best I can do. It's somewhat of a difference. Is that enough to make it into a separate mitzvah? I don't know. Next, that is, then he says, V'omer yis'ala uferet kalmocho lo yisalaket. Le'oni v'lager tazev oisam. So the emes is, the problem is dual, because the problem is in the Mitzvas Aseh that the peret and the leket are two separate mitzvahs in ashos, and also in Mitzvas Aseh. Ukfa. And you can't say that kerem per se is different, because when it comes to shikha, kerem and zeisim, and on all ilonis and tfuah is all one mitzvah. וכבר הסבירו משפטי מצווה זו מסכת פאה, ואין נוהגס מן התורה אלא בארץ. And the reason why it's ein noeges ba'aretz is because there's a mekutzchem is ktsir artzachem. And the Ram says in Perek Aleph of Hilchos Matnas Nim, Aloch Yadalet, Kol matonis aniyim le'eloi noeges min atera ba'eretz Yisrael, ketrumus u'maizah, kos v'loi mekutzchem es ktsir artzachem, ki sikso ktsir chabasodech. Now, that's what I have to say about Perek. He also is like leket in the sense, and like peya and oilos, that the ashora precedes the mitzvah aseh, and it's a lav nitavaseh. And as we pointed out, that there might be an option, a possibility that the mitzvah aseh is each lav nitavaseh requires his own individual specific mitzvah to menatek the lav. So by saying it could be then, see, it's interesting. A priori, you said that the Ram says that leket shikha and peya and oilos and nitek laseh, each one individually. In lois aseh reish yud beis. And he says the Reish Yudalad. I think it's the Reish Yudalad probably. So then you say again, not only the Gemara Chulin calls the parrot leket, but here the Matikei Shmua clearly say that there's a separate aseh for each lav. But that's not true, because the Gemara only says by peya lav nitel aseh, and the Ram concludes that the oisam applies individually. But that means the oisam applies individually, but that tells you that leket and peya you should look at individually. So I'm not sure how much you gain by that. You have to think, if the oisam applies individually and oilos, it applies to oilos. See, oilos is written together with peret, and leket is written together with peya. Okay? And there's an oisam in leket and peya in one parasha, and then there's an oisam on all of them in another parasha. In oilos, so in leket and peya, it applies separately. So for leket and peya, because oisam applies to peya, so it applies to leket also separately. So maybe the same thing, doesn't apply to oilos, but applies separately to oilos. It applies separately to peya. Maybe once it applies separately to one, it applies to all, and that's how the Ram also knows there's a separate mitzvah. You have to know if that's a possibility. But the real question is, and this is very, very important, what is the real teveya that it's separate mitzvahs? Is it in Yonei HaTeira, or it's the edus, or the meseres of the Matikei Shmua that it's a separate mitzvah? When you look at the end of Shorish Zion, when the Ram's talking about Tchelis and Lovon being one mitzvah, it's not enough for him to quote that the Matikei Shmua said, "V'hoyu lechem v'hoyu lechem letzitzis malame that Tchelis and Lovon is mitzvah achas." But he goes out of his way to say that they're really one inyan in Yonei HaTeira. And maybe the important thing is that it's an inyan echad in Yonei HaTeira. And it's not enough that you have the edus. The edus, or the meseres, is only indicative that it's a separate inyan. And that's why the Ram goes out of his way, discusses again and again, that it's a question of Yonei HaTeira in Shorish Tes. However, there's a problem. Because remember in Tefillin, the Ram quotes the Gemara Menachos that it says that if you can't do one mitzvah, if you can't do two mitzvahs, you shouldn't do one. It says a raya doch that Tefillin Shalosh and Tefillin Shayat are two separate mitzvahs. And the question is, do we actually know? Is it actually two separate inyan? L'man tia teres b'Hashem b'ficha, two separate inyan atera? So this is the main question. Is it just the Messias itself as two separate inyan? If it's the Messias itself, we have no problem over here. Because Chazal talked about Peah and Leket as two separate things. And maybe you could prove that it's a separate lav and aseh. Then you have no problem. The problem begins if it's not enough that there's an edus or there's a Messias Chazal, two separate mitzvahs. It has to be two separate Yoni Atera. And that's the overarching axiom to tell us that it's two separate mitzvahs. So then you're left with the question: is the fact that Nifrat Ruba, the Kalkola, or is a different Shir Tzira, is that enough to make it separate mitzvahs, a separate Yon Eter? So that is what I want to say in Peret. Now, next one is Bikurim. Bikurim, v'amitzvah chomesh v'esrim umeya, hi shetzivonu lohitzi habikurim. This is the Arabic word that he uses as Kapach talks about, to be mafresh, to separate. There's no assumption over here, one way or the other, whether you need a haflo b'peh. It's a separation. You separate the bikurim. We'll see you separate other matanas, but it's a separate. The question is maybe just taking this tfur and that tfur, there's no difference between the two. Maybe the separation is not enough. Maybe the Kriya Shem, maybe it's some other thing. But what the mitzvah is to separate. Lahotze habikurim, lahafish habikurim, ulaviyam lemikdash. So the mitzvah has two parts. Hafroshes bikurim and havo'osam lemikdash. So I would assume, the same way the Ram says that Nereishis Hagez, the Hafrosha and the Nesina is a Seder and it's one mitzvah, and Hafroshas Ma'aser Rishon and Nesina Levi is one mitzvah because a Seder of two performances, Beis Chalkei mitzvah. Here also the two Chalkei mitzvah. There's the Hafroshas Habikurim and the Avor Lemikdash. Now, we know, for example, the Torah says that you bring the bikurim in a tenner, in a basket or whatever it happens to be, okay? There's no discussion here of that, and that's very understandable because the use of a tenner to carry the bikurim is not chelkei mitzvah, it's really only a prat in the prote mitzvah and bikurim. So the place for that is in Hilchos Bikurim, not in Minyan HaMitzvos. And that's where he quotes it in Hilchos Bikurim, Per Gimel Halacha Zayin. Now here, it's V'hu Amra Yis'ale Reishis Bikur Ad Moscho Tovi Beis Hashem Elokecha. So there's no clue whether you need a haflo b'peh, but there has to be some designation that it's rachis. And that's what the Rashi quotes a Chumash, is that you put the gemi to know this is Biker Rishon. And that tells you that it's rachis b'kriyat mosri. You have to separate it just by the fact that Torah said rachis b'kriyat ad mosecha. There's something different than the whole tool which you have. That by the Ram assumes that is a necessity for Afrosha. There's nothing else in the pasuk. It's just rachis b'kriyat moscha. So how do you know that? You take the gemi because you have to separate it. Okay. Now here is a very important question. We had the discussion many times where the mitzvahs have to be explicit sivuyim, or the fact that you can understand a tzivui from a context, that's enough. Okay? So, if you recall, we discussed this, and this was one of the important things in terms of Sha'ana. If the Torah tells you this is the religious law, you should assume that this is what you're supposed to do. And there's an assumed command. Not that there's a chayva, but it's assumed there's an implicit command, not an explicit command. This again becomes very odd because the Mitzvas Aseh do they require explicit commands? Because you say lo, there's one lo, and it says two different things, no by Korban Pesach, umavusho, and it's only one lav. But again, the question is, why is it only lav? I mean, you understand the Torah meant you shouldn't eat this, you shouldn't eat that. Okay? And they're two separate inyanim. But it's only implicit, it's not explicit. The problem is, but the Ram says a very strange line, and you're very confusing. And Sherish Tessa always mentioned to you, he's mashma that you need a separate lo. And lo is not really the tzivui. Lo just converts a positive commandment, which could have been a tzivui, into a negative tzivui. And you need a lo for each individual mitzvah. So we're very confused over here, but l'cheira, it seems over here that rachis b'kriyat moscha, that the fact that Torah delineates that there's something called rachis b'kriyat moscha, the only way that it could be if you designate it, you put the gemi around, you separate it. So in Mela, that's a part of a mitzvah. The mitzvah consists of two things. L'hoitzi, he says, l'hoitzi abikurim u'laviyim. Tavi beis Hashem Elokecho. So l'hoitzi is rachis b'kriyat moscha, and the tavi beis Hashem Elokecho is the second thing. It's a very important thing. Then the Ram says something amazing. It says here in Ibn Tibbon's translation, it says umavur. In Kapach's translation, it says uposhet. The word in Arabic is bain, and I would assume my discussion with Mark Herman in other issues. I remember towards the beginning of Shorish Ches, when we talked about it, I could imagine it's boro. It's very clear. And I guess, whether it's mavur or boro or poshet, probably should depend upon the context. But here I would opt more uboro, since the Torah says, Beis Hashem Elokecha, uboro, HaMitzvos Aseh eino neheges el b'fnei habayis. See, for example, when it comes to korbanos, the Rambam at the end of Shorish Yudalid, or the introduction to to Minyan HaMitzvos after Shiur Shida, whatever you want to call it, he says that the mitzvahs of korbanos are not only noeg b'fnei habayis. But is that bind? Is that borrow? That's only because we assume that that somehow that when there's no Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvah havo, the mitzvah krov is not the same, even though makim b'shein bayis. So there, the Rambam makes a clear statement and a postulate that's true. However, when it comes to bikurim, the Rambam feels that he's standing on very solid ground. It's a very solid ground, and he says, "Uboro sha'mitzvah azos eino neheges ele b'fnei habayis." This Rabbeisai, when you look at it at first glance, you say, "Oh, this is the Ramban in Kisavai," that the Ramban suggests there's no bikurim in Noi V'Givon because you need bias, and the Torah says bias. So I would tell you there's not necessarily any relationship between the two. It could be anything which you mekayim the mitzvahs binyan Beis HaMikdash with, whether it's Noi V'Givon, as the Ram Mishnah Torah has it, or whether it's Shiloh or Beis Halomim, it's all called bias. Bias doesn't mean an edifice that's not an oil. Bias means that it's V'osli Mikdash, Shchante B'Soichem. That's what I was assuming means according to the Rambam. So all the Rambam is saying here, they know Hegis Ele B'fnei HaBayis. And you need bias for Bikurim, because the mitzvah is Lohovi Beis Hashem Elokecha. There's no Beis Elokecha, Hashem Elokecha. There's no Kiyum Avo. So I'm not sure exactly, or let's say I assume that in these two parts, I'm not sure what happens. Let's say you do the hafrosha without the avor. Have you done anything? Not clear to me at all, okay? But whatever it is, if the havor is impossible, even the hafrosha is there's no chiyuv, there's no mitzvah, because the Ram says if there's no bias, there's no hafrosha. There's no mitzvah. The mitzvah is not noeg b'chlal. Okay. Now the Ram continues. V'lo yuvu ela miperis Eretz Yisrael. See here again, you need Peris Eretz Yisrael. And like the mitzvahs of Matan Zanim were only noeg min HaTorah, only in Eretz Yisrael. In here, it's a Gemara Bava Basra on Pei Aleph from an Aleph, v'hoksiv asher tovei me'artzecha hahu lemuti chutz la'aretz. And this is going on Bikurim. Now, Peris Eretz Yisrael. V'surya ve'eva hayarden. And here the Ram does an amazing thing. And he says that the mitzvah of Bikurim is noeg in Eretz Yisrael, and in Surya, and in Eva hayarden. So here, the Mishnah says in Chala, the issue of Surya is the Mishnah Chala, Perek Dalet Mishnah Yud Aleph, Aristoin Hevi Bikurov Me'apamya, V'kibul Mimeno Mipnei She'omru Hakine besuya kekone beparva shiv Yerushalayim. Everyone knows the Gemara Gittin, but it's the Pavor Yerushalayim. But the source of it is a Mishnah in Chala, Perek Daled Mishnah Yudal, and it clearly says there's Bikurim in Suya. However, this is very odd because what's the purpose of the discussion? And Minyan HaMitzvos to tell you that there's Bikurim in Syria. And he quotes Eretz Yisrael and Syria and Eva Yarden in one breath. So a priori you assume that it might be Chiyuv, the Raisa. However, in Mishnah Torah, he's very clear. The Rambam in Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Beis Aloch Aleph, Mevi'im Bikurim shel Divreihem Me'oi Sichon V'Oig U'Misuya She'akoyne B'Suya K'Koyne B'Yushalayim. So he says, shel Divreihem. And the same thing in Eva Yarden, the Mishnah says, "Bikurim ve'elu meviim b'korim min atzeres v'arachag mishivas aminim miperi shebahorim mitamris shebamokim u'mizeise shemen me'eva Yarden." So the Mishnah says that's Eva Yarden. So you also could have assumed maybe it's a deraisa, and also the Esek Kedushas. There's a separate kedusha of Eva Yarden that it's for Avoros Bikurim. That's a Sefer in Nosoi. Mikan nosnu chachomim mechitzos v'omu esek kedushas hein Eretz Yisrael mikudesh b'kol harotzos. So my kedushasa shemivi menu hoime u'shtei alechem v'abikurim ma she'ein mevi'in mikol harotzos. So again, you have this issue. In Mishnah Torah, it's Mefurish, you read it before. He says, Oi Sichon v'oig, v'oi Sichon v'oig, the Bikurim is Medivreim. Kesev Mishnah, Radvaz, Marik, Sherish Kufyud Kuf Chavbeis. The question is, what was the opinion over here in Sefer HaMitzvos? Okay, next. You see, in Eva Yarden, the issue is more about Eretz Zovas Cholvash, and in Suya, the issue is about Kibush Yochid Shmei Kibush or not. And just in short, whatever it is, just in one line, I remember Rav used to ask, I say to Zayda, Chaim, whatever it is but the Maisa is the Kibush Rishon was bottled. So what difference does it make if it's Shmei Kibush or not? So what Chaim said is that the Nafkamina is the second Kibush, whether you require bona fide kibush or chazaka. The heitivcho v'hirbacho me'avesech Yerushalayim and Shvius, Perek Vov, Halacha Aleph, that the second kibush, it's enough that you can have chazaka. So the question is, what happened in Suya? If you assume in Suya it was only they had a chazaka, so then whether kibush Rishon should make kibush, that should be a nafkamina, whether it should be a kedusha deraisa or not. Umishivas haminim levad. So Ram says that bikurim are only shivas haminim. And that's a Mishnah Bikurim. Perek Aleph, Mishnah Gimel, Emivim Bikurim, Chutz Mishivas Amina. And I'm Pirush Mishnah in the Mishnah. Oma Hashem Bikurim, Lokachtem Ereishis Kol Pri Adomo, V'yom Mereish L'Kol Reishis, Eina Tomei V'yela Mishivas Aminim. Ho Amurim B'Shevach Haaretz, V'heim Amenuyim B'Posach Eretz Chit L'Seira. And that's the Sifri. Lokachtem Ereishis Kol Sifri in Kisava, Piska Top Reish Sadi Zion. That Reishis, Reishis, L'Kol Reishis, and with all the drush, we end up at Shivas Aminim. So the Chayra, it's a Pirush Makubal, that Bikurim is Zayiminim, and that's it. It's part of the Etzem Mitzvah. That's what the mitzvah is all about. Here, there's an amazing thing. Okay. Let me start like this. Let me tell you how this first came to me. I still remember vividly the Rov's second cataract operation. After the cataract operation, he was in Boston. I remember going up to visit him and describing how the surgery has changed from the time that his Zayda pushing out a cataract operation. And just one short thing, one short sentence, he said at that time, the Zayda Rab Elia had to lie down on a board of wood for 6 weeks and not move. Okay. But I recall very vividly when I came up to Boston, Brookline, Moshe Troitsky, he comes very excited. He's learning Bikurim with the Zayda, and they came across, I'm not sure, he came across, or they came across in the back, I think of the Eshkol Mishnayis, they printed the Pirush of Nosan Ava Yeshiva. And this Rav Nosan Ava Yeshiva says an amazing thing about Bikurim, but this is reflected. He basically is quoting Sefer Chayfetz from Yatzliach. This you see in Absadigoin, and you also see in the Sefer Ktsuvos. Let me tell you what it is, and then we'll try to see just the sources inside. What it is the following. The Mitzvas Bikurim is only noeg in 5 minim. Not the Chameshes Min Togon, but the 5 types of fruit. Geffen, limon, Zeis Shemen, Anovim, Tmorim, Chitin and Se'erim, the Mitzvas Bikurim is a Chayvas Sibor. It's not a Chayvas Yochid. The concept of Perish and Biker is only on the Chayvas Yochid with the Gemi. The mitzvah of the Sibor is to bring Minchas Ha'oime, Minchas Bikurim, Shtei Alechem, Ubiyom HaBikurim. There's no Chayvas Yochid to bring Bikurim of Chita and Se'era. And the Bikurim of Chita and Se'era are separate mitzvah. The mitzvah of Shtei Alechem and the mitzvah of Minchas Ha'oime. The mitzvah of Bikurim is on the Yochid, it's only on Pelis. If you look here in the Sefer Mitzvos of Sadigoin, page 208, he says like this. He's talking about the mitzvah of Kohanim, because the Ashminis, Mashebike mipri huilonois, mino anovim, vateine, varimoine, vazeisim, vatmorim. That's it. Eile chamisha minim yuchodim. Chayv alois ele mikdosh, ulesito elahem. To the Kohanim. כפי שאמרו ביקורי כל אשר בארצם. And then he says, however, אם חוששים שהפרי ינוזק, אזי יבשו ויעלו. You should dry it out. Okay? This, he didn't have then. This just was published recently. He had Rav Nosson Avi Yeshiva. Rav Nosson Avi Yeshiva quotes Rabbeinu Yatzliach, and he says, the Oma Baal HaMitzvos, means Baal Sefer HaMitzvos, Nosan Hashem leKohanim kol bikui HaPeiros v'chulei. Mehen chayvas hatzibur v'hein achitim v'aseirin. V'aseirin hu ha'omer v'chulei. V'asheni men achita la'aseh shtei alechem. And this is what we're excited about. The whole idea of bikurim has changed, that there's a chayvas yochid, which is a mitzvah, and the chayvas sibur is another mitzvah. You also have it in the halachas ksuvos. It says like this. In halachas ksuvos, hilchos ha'omer, ois gimel, v'omer hazeh min chelik echod shel soder hoyu mevin oisoi ava bibikurim shel peiros kol zman shehoyu roin echod v'echod miYisrael begagoy bekalmoy ho'anovo v'ateina o kol minei peiros hamavakeres hamavakos tchila. So he's mechalek between this, you bring a separate korban called oimer and shtei alechem, but the bikur is only on the peiros. The oddity, he says, a kol minei peiros. A little bit confused about that. Okay? That's not for us. So this you find in the Ge'inim, a whole new concept of bikurim. Now, let's continue. And that also, derech hagav, you'll find in the piyut of also of Rav Sadigoin that he happens to call the shtei alechem bikurim, but it's a separate mitzvah, and this is only peiros. Peiros. The mitzvah bikurim. Then he goes on, he says, Gufa isparu mishpatei mitzvah zo meseches bikurim vizboye shom. Now, notice there's something interesting over here. Normally, when he ends a mitzvah, he says that you find the mishpatim of this mitzvah in Masechta X. He usually doesn't go out and start explaining parts of it, okay? And v'hizboye shom shehem nichsei kohen. That nichsei kohen means mama kohen. Kloima ha'peiros habikurim. So, you see, the truth is, when you look at the mitzvah bikurim, it doesn't tell you anything about a tenufa. Here, it just tells you, you take it, you mafresh it, and you bring it to the mikdash. What happens afterwards? He doesn't tell us. Okay? See here, he assumes that the matana, that bikurim al kohanim, is only protei mitzvah. But he assumes, for some reason, it's important for us to know when we're studying Sefer HaMitzvos. And it's not stam like teneh, which he leaves from Mishnah Torah. And he finds it important. He puts it after when he tells you that it's the mitzvahs, the mishpatei mitzvah found in the Masech, and he tells you one of them is that it's nichsei kohen. That, I think, is what he's trying to tell you. Nichsei kohen, the Ram, the Pirush Mishnah, and Bikurim, Perek Beis, Mishnah Aleph. The Inyan Omroi, excuse me, Inyan Omru, Hey Nichsei Kohen, Shemakadosh B'Em Isha. And the idea is explained by Richos in the Mishnah itself, in Perek Gimel, Mishnah Yud Beis, Lomo Omer Bikurim, Kenichsei Kohen, Shuhu Kohen Mehen. What does it mean, Nichsei Kohen? He does with it, he acts with it, as if he acts with any of his other assets. Kishehu koine mehem avodim b'karkois v'behem tmei v'balmum v'balchoiv noitlon b'choivoi v'ish b'ksuvosa k'sefer Torah. In Hilchos Ishus, Perek Hey Halacha Hey, in Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Daled Mishnah Halacha Yudaled. Now, next. That's the mitzvah of Bikurim. Kuf Chof Vov. VaMitzvah Hashesh V'Esrim Umeir. He shetzivonu lahoitzi, which is lahafish truma gedola. For Omer Yis'ale Reishis Degoncho. V'goyme titen lo. So again here, we see in the pasuk that there's a tzivui about Nesina, but all it says is Reishis Degoncho. So the truth is, if you remember Sherish Beis, it says, the pasuk says, and just go back to this, Reish the goncho, tirosh yitzv, reish is gay soincho titen lo. Okay? And the Rambam says in Shorish Beis that the mitzvah of reishis hagez requires hafrosha and nesina. So the question is, where does this come from? So I can explain this to you. The Ramban says he has a whole discussion in Shurashim. He says in Sherish Yud Beis, v'nisavinu tchila v'aramosa min ha-mitzvah habo b'chala shnema v'hoye b'achochem elechem ha'oretz trimu truma l'Hashem. Reish harisa sechem chala trimu truma ketrumas goyin kein truma isa. Hare, it says that chala is like truma. Hare shehishve haromat shtein v'osa mitzvah v'zehu nigla b'kosu. Since it says kesrumas goyren kein truma isa, so you see there's a mitzvah frosha by truma. Okay. V'yesh oid bo l'abosenu b'sifri trimu truma l'Hashem b'truma gdola akosu medaber. Atoime b'truma gdola akosu medaber ein lo b'truma schala, and it's a whole drosh. That's Ramban. What I want to suggest here is maybe the Rambam is working with this new principle she has, and if the Torah designates something which requires a separation, Reishis Degoncha, how has it become Reishis Degoncha? It's not Bikurim Degoncha. What's Reishis Degoncha? Or Reishis Gei Seincha? What's Kivei? You have to separate it. So there's not an explicit command, but there's an implicit command over here again, that hafroshet. And it's amazing that an implicit command can satisfy with the requirements of Shorish Beis that you need mefurish and Torah Shabbat. So it doesn't mean mefurish, the source of the mitzvah, explicitly or implicitly should be ingrained in Torah Shabbat. And that's what he's saying over here. And it's an amazing, amazing observation. And that's what he does. He's quoting both parts. Reish is the Goncho and Titen Lo. The same way he did it in Bikurim. He said in Bikurim, it says Reish is Bikurim ad Moscho. That's the Hafrosha. And then with Tovi Beis Hashem Elokecha. The two parts. Tovi Beis Hashem Elokecha. And that's what he says. He says, Sivor Lahitzi or Lahafrish Bikurim or Lavim Lamikdosh. Here, the Rambam, I'm not sure if you can make anything out of it, only says Lahitzi, Truma Gedolah. He doesn't talk about the Nesila L'Koyin. Yeah. Now, okay. Let's now go on to the end of this. Again, that's the Gemara Kedusha. Masiz kol mitzvah she tuluya ba'oretz eino noheges ela ba'oretz. And the Gemara says in Lamed Zayin or Aleph as a limud, and the Yushalmi says ksiv ela chuka mishpatim asher tishmu la'aseis ba'oretz ba'oretz at mechayav la'aseis and mechayav la'aseis b'chutz la'oretz. And the Kiyah Sefer says that wherever it says ba'oretz, that's what the Yushalmi means, that necessarily there's a mitzvah is limited to Eretz Yisrael, but Truma ksiv ba'oretz, or b'truma sumaisis ksiv eretz. B'chol chelev dogon reishisos. B'kurei kol asher b'altzon. So that makes it only noeg in Eretz Yisrael. So the truth is, it's true. That's what I would say in the Rambam, because you see, I'm not sure how you can medayik over here, because when it comes to Reish Lagez, in Mitzvah Kuf Memdal, he said, see which is the fiddle of Hafrish, Reish Lagez Lit Makayin. Or Misal Reish is Gaze Sayin Chot Titen Loy. So I would assume it's the same thing over here, but you have to understand why the Rambam just he left out the Nesina L'Koyin. Okay. Here, Mitzvah Hashem will pick up next week in Mitzvah Aseh Kuf Chav Zayin, the mitzvah of Ma'aser Rishon. But there it says explicitly that there's Haroma. Ki es Ma'aser B'nei Yisrael asher rimu l'Hashem Truma. So Mitzvah Hashem will pick this up next week. Have a freilich Chanukah.